Joshua, speaking of brave people, we're going to be in the book of Joshua today in Joshua chapter 3. Just to give a second of background, Israel is finally going to cross the Jordan River behind Joshua. They're finally, after 40 years, going to enter the promised land. Joshua, as we saw last week and as we'll continue to see moving into this story, he has complete faith in God. He has complete faith in Yahweh to cross that swollen river. We'll see again in just a minute that during the springtime, the Jordan River swells. Just like most rivers, after snowfall, where there are snow-capped mountains, the snow comes down, the rivers swell, it gets above its banks, creeps out of its banks. At this time, the Jordan River was swollen. It was bigger than it normally is, and the current was running faster than it does at the other times of the year. But Joshua, having no idea exactly what Yahweh would do, Joshua sends the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. He sends the priests forward toward the river, and he tells the tribes of Israel, follow the priests. We're crossing that river. He doesn't know how yet, but he sends the priest with the most valuable thing in all of Israel, with the Ark of the Covenant of God, which represents the very presence of God. It was above the ark that the pillar of cloud would rest when it came to rest, and the pillar of fire by night. That's where it rested, on the mercy seat above the Ark of the Covenant. So Joshua, in great faith for God and great faith to God, God having shown him his faithfulness, Joshua sends the priest out having no idea what's coming next. In Joshua chapter 3 verse 6 we read, and Joshua spoke to the priests. And he said, take up the Ark of the Covenant and cross over ahead of the people. So they took up, what did the priests say? But Joshua, how are we going to get across the river? There were no questions. Because they had a strong leader. They trusted the leader. And they followed the leader. Follow the leader. They followed the leader here. They followed Joshua. So the priests took up the Ark of the Covenant and they crossed over ahead of the people. So they took up the ark and they went ahead of the people. Now remember what it said in verse 4, that there should be a 2,000 cubit gap between the ark leaving. Wait for 2,000 cubits for the ark to get that far away before the tribes of Israel start to leave, before the people follow. It took 4 people to carry that ark, as you see well depicted here on the board. And those 4 priests, in silence, carrying the ark for approximately 3,000 feet is what 2,000 cubits is, what it equates to in our numbers. And they walked toward that swollen Jordan River. I wonder what they were thinking, how the water was going to... I just wonder what they were thinking as they crossed the river. But they trusted Yahweh and they trusted the leader that Yahweh had put in place, Joshua. So they set out. They set out in faith that somehow they could cross that 10 to 12 foot deep, raging river. In verse 7 it says, now the Lord said to Joshua, Joshua has acted in faith, and now the Lord gives the detail. The Lord said to Joshua, this day, Joshua, I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel. So Yahweh is going to lift up Joshua as the leader of the people. In the eyes of the 2 million Jews, what God is going to do here is lift up Joshua in the eyes of the people so that they will follow him like they followed Moses. It's an interesting thing that God exalts men. He chooses at different times to exalt men. There's a verse in the New Testament that says, humble yourself before the mighty hand of God that he may exalt you in due time, when he's ready and at the proper time. God is an exalter of men. He doesn't mind lifting up men in the eyes of other men, and he's doing it right here. So God says to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. So the people can trust Joshua because God is going to be with Joshua, and he's going to prove it to the people by what he's about to do at the River Jordan. In verse 8, he says, you shall moreover command the priests. This is what's going to happen today, Joshua. Command the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, saying, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan River, you shall stand in the Jordan. Now, I tell you, the water is 10 to 12 feet deep at this time of the year. There's no way a 5'5", 5'8", 6 foot tall guy, however they are, can stand in the middle of 12 foot of water and live. So something miraculous is about to happen. You will stand still in the Jordan. And so Joshua shares with what Yahweh has told him. In verse 9 it says, Joshua said to the sons of Israel, come here. He gathers them. Hear the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, by this you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will assuredly dispossess from before you the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Girgashite, the Amorite, and the Jebusite. What's missing in that verse? In verse 10, Joshua says, God told me this. What doesn't he share that God just told him? He says, by this you shall know, by this, the miracle that's about to take place, that the priests will stand on dry ground on the riverbed of the Jordan. He says, by this you shall know, not that I am being exalted. That's what he leaves out. He doesn't say, God is making me a man among men today, so that you will follow my lead through the conquests. He gives all the glory, all the focus in this great leader goes to Yahweh. That's leadership. Strong, strong man, Joshua. By what you see today, you will know that the living God is among you, that God is in your presence, that God continues to lead you. Even though the pillar of cloud is gone now, even though the pillar of fire at night is gone now, Yahweh still leads Israel, and He's going to prove it today. And He's also going to prove a second thing, that He will, in fact, dispossess all the people in the land of Canaan from before you. He is giving you this land. And He's going to prove it to you. He's going to build your confidence in Him today. But what does Joshua leave out? He's going to build your confidence in me today as your leader. Total deflection of that fact that God just told him, today I will exalt you in the eyes of all Israel. Joshua says, I'll let God do what God does in my life. That's personal. It's private, and nobody needs to know that. A good leader doesn't pound his chest. What a man. What a man, Joshua. Deflects all honor and all glory to Yahweh, the God of Israel. In verse 12, or in verse 11, behold, he says, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth. Again, total deflection of honor and glory and worship and exalting goes to God, not to Joshua. The ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is crossing over ahead of you into the Jordan. In verse 12 he says, now then take for yourselves. Joshua gives instructions about what to do when they're crossing the river. He says, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, 1 man from each tribe. And it shall come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, when those feet rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan will be cut off, and the waters which are flowing down from above will stand in one heap. Now remember, just go back with me in history 40 years. Some of the people that are here were alive and crossed the Red Sea with Moses. Remember, the only people that died over the last 40 years were the men who were 20 years old and older. If you were 19 and a half, or 19 and 365, 64 days, if you were not 20 years old yet, you didn't die. So the oldest men that are going in are those 19-year-olds, because all of their fathers are dead. Those 19-year-olds have now lived another 40 years. They're 69, is at 59 years old. That's the oldest guy going into battle, 59 years old. And you think by today's standard, goodness, that's ancient. Our soldiers are 18, 19, 20-year-olds going into battle. But some of those men that are going into battle, the 59-year-old group, and even younger than that, they were alive when Moses crossed the Red Sea with them. So they would have been 20 years old or younger at the Red Sea, and they're alive to watch the Jordan pass. I say that because this is a unique thing for a river, for a body of water to dry up, for the land to immediately become dry so that 2 million people can cross. Some of these people have witnessed this miracle before, but for others of them, they were not alive. They wouldn't have been born. They were born in the 40 years in the wilderness. They weren't alive when they crossed the Red Sea. So for some, this was a replay of a miracle. The miracle of the Red Sea, we're going to see it again, the miracle of the Jordan River. But for others, this was history coming to life. Do you think that anybody, any one of this second generation of Israel, do you think that there was any one person alive in Israel that wasn't told the story of how God dried up the Red Sea and killed the army of the Egyptians? There wouldn't have been one of them that didn't know that story. And now the history, the miraculous hand of God is at work again. And they're about to witness, this second generation, witness something for themselves with their own eyes that their fathers surely told them and their mothers surely told them about the outstretched hand of God. So by this miracle, by the drying up of the Jordan River, these people are going to learn two things. They're going to learn that Yahweh is with them. That's what He says, that you will come to know by this that the living God is among you. So they will know that Yahweh, the living God, is present in the camp of Israel still. Remember, that's important because the cloud, the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, we're not going to see that again. It's over now. Now Israel follows the Ark of the Covenant as they move. So they're going to know that Yahweh is with them. And the second thing, the confidence builder in the parting of the waters of the Jordan River, are the fact that this same Yahweh who is with you will dispossess the people in the land. He will drive out all the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Girgashites. All of these people, He will deliver them into your hand. You will defeat them when you cross this river. And that's what God is showing you today. Those are Joshua's words. So in verse 14, we see the actual event. God has foretold it. Joshua has shared it with the people of Israel. And now it happens. Look what it says in verse 14. So when the people set out from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people, in front of the people, 3,000 feet ahead of the people. Verse 15, and when those who carried the ark came into the Jordan, you see a picture of it there. A rendition of it, let's say. Not a picture, but a rendition of it. But here it is in verse 15. When those who carried the ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows its banks all the days of harvest. If you want to know what time of year this is, it's April. It's April. And we'll see why in just a minute. It's Passover time. It's the first month of the year for Israel. It's the month Aviv, A-B-I-B. It's Aviv when they cross over into the land of Canaan to celebrate the Passover. Very interesting, the timing with which they move across the river. It says in verse 16, the waters which were flowing down. So as soon as the priests who were carrying the ark touched the waters of the Jordan River, the waters which were flowing down from above, the Jordan flows from north to south, the waters rose up in one heap a great distance away at Adam. That's the name of a village or a town. It's supposed, presumed at least, to be 18 miles north of Jericho. So the waters stopped a great deal away from where they were. At this place called Adam, that's where the waters heaped up on the Jordan River. It was a wide, dry swath that these 2 million people could cross over the river. So a great distance away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those who were flowing down toward the Sea of Arabah, the Salt Sea, we know that as the Dead Sea, the waters were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho. God dried the river. He had the water stop way upstream so this group could pass side by side very quickly. Very quickly they crossed this river. Remember that Rahab, bring Rahab up for just a minute ago. Remember Rahab already told the 2 spies that the people of Jericho were terrified of the Israelites. They were terrified of the Israelites. Do you remember why? What did Rahab tell those 2 spies the reason why the Jericho men were terrified of the Jews? You remember what it was? Here's the verse. Joshua 2 verse 10. This is Rahab. And this is what she says. For we have heard the people of Canaan, not only the city of Jericho, but others all around, as we'll see. We have heard how your God Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea. You see what scared them to death? This natural miracle, this science-type miracle, this parting of a water scared them to death. We have heard how Yahweh dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt. And not only that, but what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. So not only do we see your God do something that no man can do, that's a God act, splitting of the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds. We also saw an act of men, the people of Israel, defeat armies that they should not have been able to defeat, especially Og, the giant. They're terrified of Israel. So now what has God just shown the people of Jericho? I can do it again. Not only did I part the Red Sea and terrify you, but now in your sight, I've parted the Jordan River. Can you imagine the hearts, the melted hearts of the men of Jericho, the warriors in Jericho, how terrified they would have been now? We've only heard of what he did at the Sea of Reeds. Now we've seen with our eyes in the land in which we live, we've seen him do it again. Terrified. Terrified of this God and this people Israel. And we'll see in just a minute, if we get to it, what that allowed God to do for Israel. While their enemies stand terrified before Israel, God is able to do something for Israel. It's an astounding piece of work. God is so good at what he does. Verse 17, let's keep going. The priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed on dry ground until all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Exactly the same as the Red Sea. The miracle of parting the water wasn't enough. There was a second miracle of instantly drying the earth. You've seen water, you've seen cows, people like rancher people, and I've even seen it, cows that get stuck in a place that used to be wet, and now the water has receded from there, but the ground is still just mushy mud. You can't do anything in it. So God not only moved the water away so that they could cross and not drown, but he instantly dried that ground. And now we move into chapter 4 of Joshua, and God is telling Joshua here, let's remember this place where we are. I want Israel to remember forever what's happening here today. We're going to set up a memorial. We're going to set up a monument. We may not call it a memorial, we may call it a monument. But that's exactly what happens here. Look at what it says in Joshua 4 verse 1. Now when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua. And this is what he said. Take for yourselves 12 men from the people. He started speaking of this earlier. He told them, choose 12 men, one from each of the tribes of Israel. Now these 12 men are moved into action. I've assembled the 12 men. What do they do, Lord? He says, take for yourselves 12 men from the people, one man from each tribe, and command them, Joshua, and say this. Take up for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you onto dry land, and lay them down in the lodging place where you will lodge tonight. Not only does God bring them over a swollen river, not only does He stop the water flow, not only does He dry the riverbed, but He gives them a place of safety in the land of Canaan, a place we now know as Gilgal. He gives them a place of safety to lodge that night. Very interesting. You got to follow this story closely to see what God is doing. A mastermind at how He handles the human race. So He wants them to gather 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan River. Joshua says, he called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, one man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross again to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. They've already crossed the Jordan safely. They're already on dry ground, on ground that's always dry. And Joshua says, go back into the riverbed. These men don't hesitate. Complete faith in God on this day. This is a high watermark for Israel. You have those low points in Israel's history. Let's give them some credit sometimes. This is one of their high watermarks of faith as they crossed with Joshua across the Jordan. Joshua said to them, cross again to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder. So we're talking about something that's 200-300 pounds worth. Joshua didn't pick weak men for this. He picked some men. And they hoisted a stone up onto their shoulder. Now 12 stones, where did they get them? From the bottom of the Jordan River that normally cannot be seen. These stones would have never seen the light of day had God not dried up that river that day. No one would have ever known they were down there. But God says, bring stones up from the riverbed that will remind Israel of the miracle when these stones were visible on the dry riverbed of the Jordan. That's why He chose the stones from the middle. It would remind them that Yahweh made the waters of the river stand still, and these stones were visible for one day. Verse 6 says, let this be a sign to you. God continues speaking, or Joshua giving the direction. Let's see who is speaking here. Yeah, Josh. So let this be a sign to you, he tells the men of Israel, so that when your children ask later, what's a memorial for? It's to remember. A zakaron, a zakar. The Hebrew word zakar means to remember. A zakaron is a remembrance. So he's telling them that these stones, when we set these stones up in a pile, when your children see this pile of stones, this memorial, they're going to ask you, what do these stones mean? And that's why we set up memorials. So when our children ask us one day, Dad, Mom, what do these stones mean? Why has that been preserved? Of everything that's gone in the city of San Antonio, you can see that today if you go there. Why have Texans preserved this place, this shrine, this church we call the Alamo? So that when we go, and we've all been to the Alamo and we've taken our children, and I remember when I took my kids, they wanted to know, what is this place? So we preserve the memorial, we preserve the place so that we can remind ourselves and teach our children what happened here. Why, of all the buildings that are at the Alamo complex that were at this mission, why does this building stand? Why does this facade stand? Why was it rebuilt from about 3/4 of the way up to the top? What happened here? Did men die here? And you can tell the story. And that's exactly what's going on at the memorial that Joshua is about to set up. What about this one? This one touches, I think, near and dear to you generation of men who fought in battle. What is this? It's the Vietnam Memorial. Washington, D.C., the Vietnam Memorial. What's in the background? The Washington Monument, another memorial to a great man named George Washington, the father of our country. If I would have turned around 180 degrees, there would have been another memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, right behind me. We memorialize things so that when our children ask us, Dad, what is this wall? Why did men make this wall? What are all these names on the wall? If you'll notice, that's my kid asking me those questions. What is this? I get to tell her the story. I get to remember Vietnam and what happened in Vietnam. That's why we set up memorials. That's why we set these things up. So our children will ask us one day, what happened here? Tell me what this is about. And that's exactly what Joshua is about to do. God is commanding Joshua. Now, we don't know what it looked like, but God is commanding Joshua, you gather 12 stones from the middle of the river, and you set them up at a place that we'll name Gilgal, which means circle. So maybe these stones were not in a pile. Maybe they were in a circle rather than a heap, because the word Gilgal means circle or ring. But you send men into the river, and while the priests are there on dry ground with the Ark of the Covenant, you send 12 men in there to gather stones. One stone for each of the tribes. And when your children come here, he just says, let this be a sign to you, a memorial to you, a remembrance to you, that when your children ask you later saying, what do these stones mean? Then you shall say to them in verse 7, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off, because God can do anything, son. We can have confidence in our God, daughter, because of what God did here, what we remember God did here when we look at these stones. Because the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. Now you can't go to this place called Gilgal at the shores of the Jordan River and find these 12 stones today. Although it says, these stones shall become a memorial to the sons of Israel forever. I wonder if with Jesus Christ comes back to rule the land of Canaan as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, to rule Israel for 1,000 years, I would think that those stones are going to be put back in the place that they were in Joshua's day when he set them down. Because God said the stones will be there forever. Israel will always come back here and ask, what happened here? Interesting thought. We'll see. In verse 8, thus the sons of Israel did as Joshua commanded. There's no questioning the leader. See, while Joshua is leading, while God is parting the water and drying the sea, Joshua is being exalted in the sight of not only the priesthood, but all the people of Israel. What God said is happening is exactly what's happening. Joshua is being lifted up, and the confidence that the men have in Joshua is higher than it's ever been at this moment, and they do exactly what he says. There wasn't a question asked. It says, thus the sons of Israel did as Joshua commanded. Joshua gives all honor and glory to Yahweh. Today you'll know that the Lord God, the Lord of all the earth, and God lifts up Joshua at the same time. Joshua's not looking for a gold medal, a medal of valor for taking Israel. He's not interested in that, but God's interested in giving it. And He rewards Joshua on this day for his valor, his courage, and his faith in God. And He lifted him up in the sight of all Israel. That's what He said He would do. So now you have Israel immediately stepping to, and Joshua gives a command. They took up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, just as the Lord spoke to Joshua, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. And they carried them over with them to the lodging place, and they put them down there. In verse 9, we see that while these men are busy working, interesting, while these men are busy gathering their stones and carrying them out of the river. I love all these depictions. When I find them, I've got to show them just to give some sort of idea of what might be going on. Now, we know the waters, according to the Bible, the waters were 18 miles or so upstream. There was a large swath of dry river. They wouldn't have been walking right beside the wall of a water. But this is an interesting depiction, because while the 12 men have gathered their stones and are taking them out of the river, you see something else going on in the middle of the river there. Now I'm talking about right here. This is the way I interpret this picture. Because look what it says here. Joshua wants to set up a memorial to his God also. It's going to be a personal and a private memorial, because no one will see it after this day. But Joshua, it says, set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan. So once the water comes back, no one will ever see it. But Joshua knows they're there, and God knows they're there. So Joshua sets up his own 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan, at the place where the feet of the priest who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and they are there to this day. Now that would have been at the writing of this. Whether those rocks are still there today, we don't know. I wonder if scuba divers have gone to try to find them. It's not the clearest of rivers, the Jordan. But Joshua, where the 12 men were gathering large stones from the river to take them out of the riverbed, Joshua goes into the riverbed and gathers 12 stones together and sets up a memorial on the riverbed, exactly where the people of Israel crossed over, to have a memorial to God's faithfulness to Israel. It's just one of those things that He set up for Himself, and He set it up for God. Because only God can see it now. A memorial to the faithfulness of Yahweh for leading His people Israel across. Very interesting. Verse 10 says, for the priests who carried the ark were standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to speak to the people, according to all that Moses had commanded Joshua. And the people hurried and they crossed. Not much pomp and circumstance there. The people hurried and crossed. The people, Israel, God's chosen people, are going into the promised land. They have set foot in the promised land finally. After 500 years of not being in the land of promise, finally Israel crosses over into the promised land. They're in the land that God promised Abraham. And as God would have it, they're there to stay forever. But Israel wouldn't have it that way. That was God's intention. But finally, they're in the promised land. The people hurried and they crossed. And when all the people had finished crossing, the ark of the Lord and the priests crossed before the people. So the ark and the priests stood in the middle of the river until everybody had passed. And then once everybody was out on normally dry ground, safe ground, the priests took up their walk. They passed probably through the midst of Israel, in the middle of them, and they took their place at the front again. That's what we just read. But look at what remember there were 3 tribes, 2.5 tribes, that wanted pasture land on the east side of the Jordan River, what we call the Trans-Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan River. Those are the tribes of Gad, Reuben, Gad, and the half of the tribe of Manasseh. They're not half a tribe. What it means is that half of this 100% grouping that makes up Manasseh, 50% of them decided to settle on the east side of the Jordan. The other 50% or so of the tribe did cross the river and settled in the land of Canaan. That's what the half of the tribe of Manasseh. But look what Israel is ready for. I bring this up because look what the Bible says Israel is ready for. In verse 12 it says, the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over in battle array before the sons of Israel, just as Moses had spoken to them. Remember, Moses made a deal with them. I'll give you land on the east side of the Jordan, but you have to promise that you will take up arms and cross with your brothers, the other tribes of Israel, and go into the land of Canaan and wage battle with the Canaanites. When the land of Canaan has been subdued, when Israel can live at peace, then you men can cross back over the Jordan, back to your farms and your pasture lands. You can reunion with your wives and your children, but you will cross over and fight. And the men of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh said, we agree. We agree, we'll do it. And that's exactly what they did. I tell you, this is a high watermark for the people of Israel. A lot of obedience on this day. The sons of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, they were ready to fight. They crossed over in battle array, it says, about 40,000 equipped for war, crossed for battle before the Lord to the desert plains of Jericho. They knew they were crossing the river to fight, and they were ready for it, prepared for battle. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel. Joshua wasn't looking for it. He wasn't looking for it. Joshua did his job. He obeyed the Lord. He had faith in what God told him he would do, and he merely walked out in faith and got it done. The Lord's idea in God's due time was to exalt Joshua, so he did on this day. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel so that they revered him. They didn't worship him. They respected him and revered him as a man of honor, just as they had revered Moses all the days of his life. What a man to be in concert with. Now Joshua is lifted up in the sight of the people, equal to the man Moses. What an event. The Lord continues in verse 15, speaking to Joshua. Now the Lord said to Joshua, command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony that they come up from the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, and he said, come up from the Jordan. It came about when the priests who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord had come up from the middle of the Jordan as they're walking off of the riverbed. And the soles of the priest's feet were lifted up to the dry ground, the normally dry ground. The waters of the Jordan returned to their place and went over all its banks as before. That would have been quite a sight. Remember, the waters are pouring down from 18 miles away. I wonder if you could hear the rushing water coming down through the valley as the priests are walking out. And just in time as the priests walk out, here come the waters. That's the way the Hebrew makes it sound here, that it was a very quick event. When they got out of the waters met them. Poetically, I'll say this next phrase, poetically. It's as if the waters of the Jordan River wouldn't dare approach the presence of God. That's a poetic statement. It's as if the water, and I'll show you why I make a statement like that. It's as if the water itself, the created water of God, wouldn't dare come into the presence of God Himself, which the Ark of the Covenant represented. Only when the ark left the riverbed did the waters dare continue to flow. Now, there was a British poet, 1850s or so, named Lord Byron, probably the most famous British poet. And speaking of the day when Jesus Christ turned water into wine at the wedding in Cana, this is what Lord Byron poetically said. He says, "The water met its master and blushed." I love I'm not a guy for poetry usually, but some poetry really, really strikes a chord. So to Lord Byron, that the water could turn itself into wine, blushed, turn red, turn into wine. The water met its master, and as the water, this created event, this water, this created thing meets the master, its creator, Jesus Christ, it blushed. I just love the idea. You say, "Rick, this is just poetry. Where do you get that from?" I get it from the Bible. What's the poetry book in the Bible called? What's the book of poetry? It's got a name. The Psalms. And look what the poet David, King David, wrote in the Psalms in Psalm 68, verse 7 and 8. This is how David speaks of the earth when it comes into the presence of God. He says, King David, the king of Israel, "O God, when you went forth before your people, when you marched through the wilderness, Selah, the earth quaked. The heavens also dropped rain at the presence of God." It's as if the clouds in the presence of God couldn't hold on to their water anymore, and they just dropped everything that they were holding. Sinai itself, look at how he personifies, he makes earthly created things personal. He gives them life. He says Sinai itself quaked at the presence of God, the God of Israel. The mountains shook when God came down to it. You see? Now we know that God caused the mountain to shake, but I love the imagery of the Bible that the earth in the presence of God loses itself. And Israel, unfortunately, in the presence of God, didn't quake the way they should have. They didn't drop their rain as the clouds did in the presence of God. There's poetry in the Bible. So when Lord Byron says, "The water met its master and blushed," it's just another poet. Just another poet speaking of the brilliance of God and the miracle of God. Of course, we know that Jesus turned that water into fermented wine, but the poet says the water saw its master and blushed. Verse 19. Now the people came up from the Jordan. Why do I know it's April? The month we would call April, the month they call Aviv. Later you'll read in the Bible after the Babylonian captivity, this same month is called Nisan. Nisan, Nissan, not the car. A Babylonian word, Nisan. It's the same month. Verse 19 says, "Now the people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month." See, God's a record keeper. He's a perfect historian. He doesn't leave anything to man's imagination. He nails down the day. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern edge of Jericho. He gives us the date. He gives us the geography. He tells us everything about the event. Go look for the stones. When Israel first read this, they could have gone and seen the stones. Gilgal, as I said before, means circle, or ring. And this is probably at this time not a city at all. The first city they could have seen that they came to was Jericho. It later became a city. Right now it's just a place where they camped out, most likely. It would later be given the name Gilgal. But the first month is the month of Aviv, and it's the 10th day of the first month. Anybody remember what happens on the 10th day of the first month in Israel? Anybody? You pick your lamb to kill. It's Passover time. On the 10th day of the first month, you select that lamb, that unblemished lamb, and for the next 4 days you inspect that lamb so that on the 14th day of the month you slaughter the lamb. This is selection day. In Exodus chapter 12, 1-3, this is what it says. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you. It is to be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th of this month," catch the wording, exactly the same, on the 10th of the first month in Joshua chapter verse 19 there, and here it says the exact same thing. On the 10th of this month, they are each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to their father's household, a lamb for each household. This is the day when the Passover lamb is selected. Okay, back up just a minute. What are the men of Israel ready to do? The tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh crossed over in battle array, ready to fight. And what does God say? Worship first. Worship. Worship. I told you last time, spiritual preparation is more important than any other type of preparation. That's why Joshua, as they're preparing to cross the Jordan River a few days before, said, consecrate yourselves, make yourselves holy, purify and cleanse yourself before God. Get spiritually right with God before you start across the river. And now what does God have them do? He brings them across the Jordan, finally, after all this time, into the land flowing with milk and honey. And what does He want them to do? Worship me. Bow down and worship me. This whole event is about worshiping and bringing glory to God. The fact that the land of Canaan was ever given to Israel, promised to Abraham in the first place, was so that there would be a cleansed place on earth where God would be worshiped in purity, where all the other nations would see how Israel would do it and say, we want that relationship with that God Yahweh. So what does He say for them to do as they move in? Worship me. It's Passover time. Verse 20. Back in Joshua, it says, those 12 stones which they had taken from the Jordan, Joshua set up at Gilgal. He said to the sons of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what are these stones? Then you shall teach your children. I love this because you can see very clearly that the role of teaching the children is given in the Bible to parents. Teach your children. You shall teach or inform your children, saying, Israel crossed this Jordan River on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which He dried up before us until we had crossed. Remember, Joshua saw the Red Sea crossing. Joshua and his friend Caleb walked across the Red Sea, and now they've walked across the Jordan River. So the monument, the memorial is set up here so that the children and the children's children and all future generations would know God acted on behalf of Israel right here. You can worship this God all your life. He's a faithful, trustworthy God. He's a God with an outstretched arm like no other God. He's all powerful, and we witnessed it right here when the shores of this water became dry and we crossed over. That's what it's about. But why? Why such drama? Why such a dramatic event? The splitting of the river. Look at what it says in verse 24. That all the peoples of the earth, it's not just about Israel, it's for everybody. That all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of Yahweh is mighty, This is an omnipotent, all-powerful thing, that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is almighty, so that they may fear the Lord, so that they may fear the Lord your God forever. Worship of Yahweh was not just for Israel. Israel was to gather people to the worship of Yahweh. It wasn't exclusive to Israel. Israel was to be the magnet that drew people in to a life of spirituality with God, with Yahweh, so that all the peoples of the earth may fear the Lord your God forever. Yes, He's the personal God of Israel, His chosen nation, but He's the God of all the earth. Only have time to do this. I've done it 2 or 3 times in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I'll keep doing it because we need to know it. What does it mean that all the peoples of the earth would fear God? To reverence Him as sovereign. To reverence Him as the only thing that has the right to be the ruler. Where does authority come from? From God. Who is the ultimate authority? Only God. Who has the right to rule the earth? Only God. So to fear God means to reverence Him as sovereign. He alone has the right to rule. He's the one who exercises supreme authority. Only God has the right to rule His creation, and that includes mankind. So all the peoples of the earth from the drying of the Jordan River could have learned this. What else does it mean to fear God? To trust Him implicitly, without question. If God says it, do it. Simple as that. And that's exactly what we see Joshua and the people of Israel and the priests do. Especially the priests that are walking into this swollen river thinking, okay, Lord, we're waiting. We're waiting on You. We're not trying to figure this out in our own heads. Reminds me of a proverb. We're not trying to do what we think is right. We're waiting on You. To trust Him implicitly, it also means to obey Him without question. Trust and obedience are 2 different things. Trust has to come first. I have trust in this God. I have faith that what He says is right, even though it may not look right to me, even though I may think I'm going into the Jordan River to drown in the river. I trust God, so I'm marching toward the Jordan River today. I have no idea what He's going to do, but I will obey Him without question. And it also means to fear Him, just like the people, just like Rahab, a good example of that right now. She feared the God of Israel and what He could do. All the people of Jericho feared the God of Israel. Number 4 there. They feared Him. I mean physical, trembling, shaking, fearing a God who could dry up a river and bring a nation across on dry ground. But only Rahab responded properly, the right way, as her fear of God grew, watching the Jordan River dry up, when all the people of Jericho were entrenched and calcitrated to their fear of God, but they wouldn't bow to Him. Strange times. Joshua chapter 5 we'll move into next time, but let's just read one verse talking about fear. It says, "Now it came about when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, when they heard how the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the sons of Israel until they all crossed, their hearts melted, and there was no spirit in them any longer because of the sons of Israel." They were terrified at what they had seen. Now I ask the question, and read ahead please. I ask the question, with all the people terrified of Israel, wouldn't it be, if you're a military man, the perfect time to attack? What's the answer? Yes. But what does God have in mind? Let's take a week and circumcise everyone that's not been circumcised. Worship first. Let me take care of the battle. Nobody is going to attack you, Israel. I guarantee it. I have terrified them. They're not going to come out against you. You have faith in me. You trust me and obey me without question. You have all this generation that grew up in the wilderness. Have these men circumcised. Have them out of commission for 4 or 5 or 6 days. And then I'll tell you what's next. Wow, what a God. What a story. Let's close in prayer. Father,